as the opposing oppositions would like to break down the arguments of the Prime Minister. First, the Prime Minister argument was to have a standardized political knowledge test to reassure that the citizens have a sufficient political knowledge prior to voting. The urgency that the Prime Minister described is first to ensure that the survivability of the democracies, because not knowledgeable people of political will actually make people easily swayed by rhetoric elements and put their vote without being objective about who they are going to choose. This way, people can be polarized and people choices can be led easily instead of their own choices. This will hinder people from being very objective, and this will actually help a responsible candidate or campaign to sway people in their own choices. However, our rebuttal will be something like this. The first point that we want to ask is, who has the right to make the test? In what area of political knowledge that this, and then our second question should be, in what area of political knowledge that this test measures? Like, when we are talking about politics, there are issues, a lot of issues that regarding in politics. For example, human rights. How do you test a human right? How could one possibly measure human right in a standardized test? It's like the Prime Minister is, the Prime Minister is treating something so subjective like political view into something very objective. So they think that it could be put into a standardized test. However, we have to know that political view is something very subjective. You cannot possibly have a standardized measures to measures that you can possibly have a standardized test to actually measures someone's political view. How do you even differentiate whether one political view is wrong and one political view is right? It cannot be measured. It's not as simple as a mathematical problem like 1 + 1 is 2 or 1 - 1 equals 0. It's not something like that. And then we believe that actually, in the contrary of the urgencies that the Prime Minister had already explained, we believe that the standardized test actually will cause harm more than good. Like, since we do not exactly know who actually create this test, who actually create this standardized test, this standardized test could actually be an instrument of the polarization itself, in which that the Prime Minister is so desperately wanted to avoid. This test could actually become a polarization instrument, because such tests could be created with questions in which that would lead people's opinions into choosing a certain political view instead of actually developing their own understandings of what the current political situation is and choose based on their own beliefs of whether the political view that they know is the right choices or not, or something like that. And then to actually solve these issues, we as the opposing governments, we as the opposing oppositions would like to argue that the standardized test is not what we want at all. We believe that it is better, instead of forcing people to take a standardized test and actually in an attempt to measures that people have a sufficient political knowledge prior to the voting. Instead, we would like to regulate how the campaign works. We should regulate the campaign in a standardized manner, like every campaign should explicitly and honestly provide the voters with the most detailed background records of the candidate they would like to vote for. For example, the campaign should provide information of when the candidates start involving in political work, like what kind of achievements, what kind of political achievements that they have already achieved. This kind of information will help people to put their vote more objectively without jeopardizing their right to freedoms of choices. People will have to be able to choose based on these explicit informations, and then choose whose candidate is best for these nations based on their own beliefs when they are provided with this kind of detailed informations. And then our second argument is government should make sure that every piece of information about the candidate is provided by the campaigning company is true nonetheless and should be sanctioned, and whoever falsifying or hiding certain details of the candidate should be sanctioned punishments, who are proven to be falsifying or covering their political background information that could actually lead people to choose them. And then our third argument and final argument is the preventing of black campaign. Any form of black campaign should be prohibited, no matter how whether it is explicit or not. Like for example, if one campaigning releases a certain kind of information that has potential to actually tarnish the names of other candidates, the government should also regulate this. They have to give a proper punishment to this kind of actions, because if they have this kind of informations beforehand, they should not release it to the public, because it could actually jeopardizing what people want to choose. This is not the campaign company should have releases this kind of information to the government instead of releasing them to the public, and then the government of course will have to give a proper punishments to the candidates being mentioned, and then instead of just releasing all the data that would potentially tarnish the names of the other candidates to the public, they should have only release these informations or report the informations to the government instead, and then the government will of course have to process this kind of information and give according punishments to the candidate.
More.
More.